The cold rain poured mercilessly from the darkening, Wyoming sky as Beatrice Dawson clutched her tattered wedding dress, now sodden and mud-splattered, desperately seeking shelter in the unfamiliar frontier town. Her dreams of a new beginning had shattered just hours earlier, leaving her alone, abandoned, and drenched to the bone on what should have been the happiest day of her life. "Please, sir," Beatrice pleaded, her voice trembling as she stood before the hotel keeper, rainwater dripping from her once elegant updo onto the wooden porch of Hollow Creek's only proper establishment. "I have nowhere else to go." The hotel keeper, a portly man with small, calculating eyes, looked her up and down, taking in her bedraggled appearance with undisguised disdain. "No room for a woman without a husband or proper payment," he declared coldly. "Especially not one in your condition." His gaze lingered judgmentally on her ruined wedding dress. "But I was to be married today," Beatrice explained, fighting back tears. "My fiancé, he's gone. The stagecoach never arrived." "Not my problem, miss," the man replied, already closing the door. "We don't take in strays." "Try the church, though Pastor Williams left for Cheyenne last week." The door slammed in her face, leaving Beatrice alone on the porch as thunder cracked overhead. She clutched her small carpet bag, the only possession she had left, and turned to face the muddy Main Street, now transformed into a river of sludge by the unrelenting downpour. It was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially one who had traveled all the way from Boston with nothing but promises and dreams to sustain her. Now those dreams lay in tatters, just like her sodden white dress. "Miss, you all right there?" The voice came from behind her, deep and steady against the pounding rain. Beatrice turned to see a tall figure approaching, his features shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. As he stepped onto the porch, the light from the hotel's windows illuminated a face weathered by sun and wind, but with eyes that held genuine concern. Beatrice faltered, pride warring with desperation. "I'm fine, thank you." The stranger's expression made it clear he didn't believe her. "You're shivering something fierce," he observed, removing his duster and placing it gently around her shoulders before she could protest. The coat smelled of leather, horses, and wood smoke, distinctly masculine but oddly comforting. "Thank you, but I couldn't possibly," she began. "Name's Tucker Frost," he interrupted, tipping his hat slightly. "And unless I'm mistaken, you're in need of shelter for the night." Beatrice hesitated, years of proper Boston upbringing warning her against trusting a strange man in this wild country, but something in his steady gaze reassured her. "Beatrice Dawson," she replied finally, "and yes, I find myself in rather dire circumstances." Tucker glanced at her wedding dress, then at the closed hotel door, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Jasper turned you away, didn't he? Miserable old skinflint." He shook his head. "Come on, then. Can't leave you out in this." "Where?" Beatrice asked, clutching the coat tighter around her shoulders. "My place. It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Seeing her hesitation, he added, "You've got my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe." "I can sleep in the stable if it makes you more comfortable." Beatrice weighed her options, which were, in truth, non-existent. Stay out in the storm and likely catch her death, or trust this stranger who seemed at least to have some decency about him. "I would be most grateful," she said finally. Tucker nodded once, took her carpetbag, and offered his arm. Together they stepped off the porch into the torrent, making their way through the muddy street toward the edge of town. The rain continued unabated, but beneath Tucker's coat, Beatrice felt the first warmth she'd experienced since the stagecoach had arrived without her intended husband. They walked in silence for nearly 20 minutes, leaving the small cluster of town buildings behind and following a winding path through stands of pine trees. Finally, a small cabin came into view, smoke curling from its stone chimney despite the rain. Tucker led her up the steps to a covered porch, then pushed open the wooden door. Warm light spilled out, revealing a modest but tidy interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, and simple furnishings, a table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a bed in the corner filled the single room. "This is home," Tucker said simply, gesturing for her to enter. "Not much to look at, but it keeps the weather out." Beatrice stepped inside, the warmth of the fire immediately drawing her forward. It's wonderful, she said honestly, relief flooding through her as she realized she would not have to spend the night in the rain. Tucker closed the door behind them and hung his hat on a peg. In the firelight, Beatrice could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his shirt, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "You can hang your things by the fire to dry," he said, taking his coat from her shoulders and placing it on a hook. "I'll put some coffee on. You look like you could use something warm." "Thank you," Beatrice said, suddenly acutely aware of her appearance. Her carefully arranged hair had come undone, falling in damp tendrils around her face, and her once beautiful wedding dress was a sorry sight indeed. "There's a screen in the corner," Tucker said, nodding toward a folded wooden partition, "and a trunk with some clothes. My sister left some things last time she visited. They might fit you well enough until yours dry out." Beatrice felt tears pricking at her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "You're very generous, Mr. Frost." "Tucker," he corrected, busying himself with the coffee pot. "And it's nothing. Can't have you catching your death in that wet dress." Behind the privacy screen, Beatrice found the trunk and, with some relief, changed out of her ruined wedding gown into a simple calico dress that was only slightly too large. She did her best to arrange her hair, using the small mirror propped against the wall, then stepped out, feeling somewhat more human. Tucker had set 2 steaming mugs on the table and was slicing bread and cheese onto a wooden plate. He glanced up as she appeared, and something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at the transformation. "Better?" he asked, pulling out a chair for her. "Much," Beatrice admitted, sitting down gratefully. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness." Tucker shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Anybody would have done the same. "No," Beatrice said quietly, thinking of the hotel keeper's cold rejection. "They wouldn't have." For a moment, they sat in silence, sipping the strong coffee and listening to the rain battering the roof. "So," Tucker finally said, "you want to tell me what brings a Boston lady all the way to Hollow Creek in a wedding dress?" Beatrice's hands tightened around her mug. "How did you know I'm from Boston?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Your accent. Plus, those fancy boots you're wearing aren't made for Wyoming mud." Despite everything, Beatrice found herself returning his smile. "You're observant. Comes with the territory," Tucker replied. "When you work with cattle, you learn to notice details. They can mean the difference between life and death out here." "You're a cowboy, then?" Tucker nodded. "Work for the Rockingham Ranch just north of here. Been there 5 years now." Beatrice took another sip of coffee, finding comfort in its warmth. "I came to marry Edward Harrington. He came west 2 years ago to establish himself, then sent for me when he had a home ready." The pain of betrayal washed over her again. "But when the stagecoach arrived today, he wasn't there to meet it. The driver gave me a letter instead." Tucker waited patiently as she composed herself. "Edward wrote that he had found someone else a widow with property. He apologized for the inconvenience and suggested I return to Boston on the next stage." Bitterness crept into her voice. "As if I hadn't sold everything I owned to come here, as if I hadn't left my entire life behind." "What a yellow-bellied coward," Tucker said, anger flashing in his eyes. "Pardon my language, Miss Dawson, but a man who do that doesn't deserve the title." "Beatrice, please," she corrected him softly. "And yes, I'm inclined to agree with your assessment. So what will you do now?" Tucker asked. Beatrice stared into her coffee cup, reality settling heavily on her shoulders. "I don't know. I have very little money, just what I brought for emergencies. Not enough for passage back east, certainly." Tucker was quiet for a moment, then said, "Hollow Creek's not much, but there might be work. The school teacher left last month married a miner from over in Silver Gulch. Town's been looking for a replacement." Hope stirred in Beatrice's chest. "I was a teacher in Boston," she said. "For 3 years before Edward proposed." "Well, there you go," Tucker said, as if it were all settled. "You can stay here until you get on your feet. I'm away at the ranch most days anyway." Beatrice looked at him in astonishment. "I couldn't possibly impose. It's no imposition," Tucker interrupted. "Cabin's just sitting empty most of the time. Be nice to know it's being used." "But your reputation, my reputation," Tucker's expression softened. "Folks around here mind their business for the most part." And those that don't can answer to me." The quiet confidence in his voice suggested this wasn't an idle threat. Beatrice studied him, trying to understand why this stranger would offer such kindness. "Why are you helping me, Tucker?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "5 years ago, I arrived in Hollow Creek with nothing but the clothes on my back and a lot of bad memories. Someone helped me when I needed it most. Seems only right to do the same." There was clearly more to the story, but Beatrice sensed it wasn't the time to press. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you." Tucker nodded once, then stood to add wood to the fire. "You should get some rest. Take the bed, I'll make a pallet here by the fire." Too exhausted to argue, Beatrice thanked him again and retreated to the bed in the corner. Despite the strangeness of her situation, sleep came quickly, aided by the rhythmic sound of rain on the roof and the comforting presence of her unexpected guardian. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Beatrice woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up to find Tucker already dressed and moving quietly around the cabin. "Morning," he said when he noticed she was awake. "Hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," Beatrice assured him, quickly smoothing her hair. "I should be up anyway." Tucker set a plate of bacon and biscuits on the table. "Breakfast isn't fancy, but it'll keep you going." "It looks wonderful," Beatrice said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. As they ate, Tucker outlined his plan. "I need to head to the ranch, but I'll take you to town first. Figure you might want to inquire about that teaching position." "Yes, that would be sensible," Beatrice agreed, though the thought of facing the townspeople after yesterday's humiliation made her stomach clench. "Mrs. Miller at the general store is on the school board," Tucker continued. "She's a good woman, fair-minded. And she's no friend of Harrington's, so that'll work in your favor." Beatrice looked up sharply. "You know Edward?" Tucker's expression darkened slightly. "Everybody knows everybody in a town this size. Harrington owns the lumber mill at the edge of town. He's not well-liked, but he employs a fair number of men, so people tolerate him." The knowledge that she might encounter Edward in this small community hadn't occurred to Beatrice, and the realization sent a wave of anxiety through her. Tucker seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry about Harrington. He spends most of his time at the mill or at his fancy new house outside town. You probably won't cross paths much." After breakfast, Tucker saddled his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, and helped Beatrice mount behind him. The ride to town was brief but pleasant, the Wyoming landscape stunning in the morning light. Mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the summer season, and wildflowers dotted the green meadows surrounding the trail. "It's beautiful," Beatrice breathed, taking in the vast openness so different from Boston's crowded streets. "That it is," Tucker agreed. "Takes some getting used to, but once it gets under your skin, no other place feels quite right." In town, things looked very different by daylight. Hollow Creek was smaller than Beatrice had realized, just one main street with perhaps 24 buildings. The hotel that had denied her shelter stood prominently in the center, its painted sign declaring it the Hollow Creek Hotel, finest accommodations in the county. Tucker snorted when he caught her looking at it. Finest between here and nowhere, maybe. He reined in his horse in front of a 2-story building with Miller's General Merchandise painted across its wooden facade. Helping Beatrice dismount, he said, "Mrs. Miller should be opening up about now. I'll introduce you before I head out." The store was indeed just opening, a plump, gray-haired woman sweeping the porch as they approached. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," Tucker called. The woman looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Tucker Frost, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in town for an age." Her curious gaze shifted to Beatrice. "Mrs. Miller, this is Miss Beatrice Dawson, recently arrived from Boston," Tucker said. "Miss Dawson, Mrs. Eliza Miller, finest shopkeeper west of the Mississippi." Mrs. Miller chuckled at the flattery. "Charmer as always, Tucker." She extended a hand to Beatrice. "Welcome to Hollow Creek, Miss Dawson." "Thank you," Beatrice said, shaking the offered hand. "Tucker mentioned you might know about a teaching position, Mrs." Miller's eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced between them, clearly noting the use of Tucker's first name, but she made no comment. "Indeed I do." We've been without a teacher for nearly a month now. The children are running wild and their parents are at their wits' end. You have experience. 3 years teaching in Boston, Beatrice confirmed. Well, that's a blessing straight from Providence, Mrs. Miller declared. Come inside and we'll discuss the particulars while Tucker goes about his business. Tucker tipped his hat. I'll be back in town on Saturday, he told Beatrice. You need anything before then, Mrs. Miller knows how to reach me. Thank you again, Beatrice said softly, suddenly reluctant to see him go. With a nod and a final tip of his hat to Mrs. Miller, Tucker mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Beatrice to face her new reality. Inside the store, which smelled pleasantly of coffee, leather, and spices, Mrs. Miller wasted no time getting down to business. Now then, Miss Dawson, why don't you tell me what really brings you to our little town, and why Tucker Frost is acting as your escort? Beatrice hesitated, but something in the older woman's kind but shrewd expression convinced her that honesty was the best approach. She explained about Edward, the failed wedding plans, and Tucker's rescue. Rather than the judgment Beatrice feared, Mrs. Miller's face showed only sympathy and indignation on her behalf. That Edward Harrington, she huffed when Beatrice finished, always did think too highly of himself. You're well rid of him, my dear, though I'm sorry for the circumstances. Tucker offered his cabin as temporary lodging, Beatrice added quickly, wanting to make the situation clear. He's staying at the ranch. Mrs. Miller nodded thoughtfully. Tucker's a good man, one of the best, been through his own troubles, but came out decent despite it all. She fixed Beatrice with a penetrating look. You could do a lot worse for a friend in these parts. I'm very grateful to him, Beatrice agreed. Well then, Mrs. Miller said briskly, let's discuss this teaching position. Pay isn't much, $30 a month, but you get lodging in the rooms above the schoolhouse, and most families contribute food and firewood. Term starts in 2 weeks, which gives us time to get you settled. Beatrice felt a wave of relief wash over her. It sounds perfect, Mrs. Miller. I'm very interested. Excellent. I'll call a school board meeting for tomorrow. Just a formality, mind you, we're desperate for a qualified teacher, and your Boston credentials will impress the board mightily. By noon, Beatrice had met 3 of the 5 school board members, all of whom seemed pleased with her qualifications. Mrs. Miller had also introduced her to several townspeople who happened to stop by the store, carefully explaining that she was their new schoolteacher, recently arrived from Boston, with no mention of Edward Harrington. No sense giving gossips more fodder, Mrs. Miller said pragmatically. What's between you and Edward is your business. After closing the store for lunch, Mrs. Miller took Beatrice to see the schoolhouse, a simple but solid building at the edge of town with a bell tower, and 2 rooms above that would serve as Beatrice's living quarters. It's modest, Mrs. Miller apologized as they climbed the stairs to what would be Beatrice's new home, but clean and private. The rooms were indeed small, a bedroom and a combined sitting room/kitchen, but after the events of the past day, they looked like paradise to Beatrice. Windows overlooked the town on one side and open meadows on the other, letting in ample light. It's perfect, Beatrice assured her guide. When might I move in? Right away, if you like, Mrs. Miller said. The rooms are ready. I've kept them clean since Miss Henderson left. She paused, then added delicately, though perhaps you'd be more comfortable at Tucker's cabin until you have proper furnishings. These rooms are rather bare at present. Beatrice considered the empty spaces, then nodded slowly. Perhaps for a few days until I can acquire the necessities. Sensible girl, Mrs. Miller approved. Now, let's get you back to the store. I suspect you'll be needing a few things, and I'm happy to extend credit until your first salary payment. By the end of the day, Beatrice had ordered a bed, a table, and 2 chairs from the local carpenter, purchased linens and kitchen necessities from Mrs. Miller, and begun to feel, if not settled, then at least less adrift. Mrs. Miller insisted she stay for supper, introducing her to Mr. Miller, a quiet man who seemed content to let his wife do most of the talking. Tucker should be back on Saturday, Mrs. Miller reminded her as she walked Beatrice back to the cabin in the fading light. But if you need anything before then, you come straight to me, you hear. Thank you, Mrs. Miller, you've been incredibly kind. Nonsense, the older woman dismissed the gratitude. We look after our own in Hollow Creek, and you're one of us now." The next 5 days passed in a blur of activity. The school board unanimously approved Beatrice's appointment, and she threw herself into preparing for the upcoming term. She cleaned the schoolhouse from top to bottom, organized the meager selection of books, and began planning lessons. Each evening, she returned to Tucker's cabin, which began to feel strangely like home despite its owner's absence. She kept it tidy, replaced the firewood she used, and even planted some flower seeds she had purchased from Mrs. Miller in the small patch of earth beside the porch. On Friday afternoon, as Beatrice was hanging freshly washed curtains in her new rooms above the schoolhouse, a familiar voice called from below. "Miss Dawson, you up there?" Her heart gave an unexpected leap as she hurried to the window. Tucker stood in the schoolyard, looking up at her, his horse tethered to the hitching post. "Tucker, you're back early," she called down, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "Finished up sooner than expected," he replied. "Mrs. Miller said I'd find you here. I'll be right down." Beatrice checked her appearance quickly in the small mirror. She had hung her hair was slightly disheveled from her work, and her plain blue dress was wrinkled, but there was no help for it. She hurried down the stairs and out into the schoolyard, suddenly shy in Tucker's presence. He looked much as he had when he left, tall and solid, his skin perhaps a shade darker from days in the sun. But something about seeing him again after these days apart made Beatrice notice details she had missed before, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other when he smiled, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. "The place looks different," Tucker observed, nodding toward the schoolhouse. "Brighter. Just some cleaning and new curtains," Beatrice said. "The previous teacher left it in quite a state." "Heard you got the job," Tucker said, his tone approving. "And that you've made quite an impression on the town." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "Everyone's been very welcoming. Mrs. Miller thinks you hung the moon," Tucker chuckled. "Been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen." "She's been incredibly kind," Beatrice agreed, "as have you." "I've kept your cabin in order, I promise." "Never doubted it." Tucker's expression grew more serious. "Actually came to see if you wanted to move your things to your new rooms. Got the wagon in town. Mrs. Miller mentioned you'd ordered some furniture." "Yes, it was delivered yesterday," Beatrice confirmed. "But I don't want to impose on your time." "No imposition," Tucker interrupted, using the same phrase he had that first night. "Happy to help." The sincerity in his voice silenced any further protests. "Thank you, then." "I don't have much to move." They walked back to town together, Tucker leading his horse, while Beatrice told him about her preparations for the school term. He listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Sounds like you've got everything well in hand," he said as they reached the store where Tucker had left the wagon. "Those kids are lucky to have you." "I just hope I can live up to expectations," Beatrice admitted. "Teaching here will be quite different from Boston." Tucker helped her into the wagon before climbing up beside her. "Different maybe, but I reckon the important parts are the same. Kids need someone who cares enough to teach them right, no matter where they are." The simple wisdom in his words struck Beatrice deeply. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I suppose that's true." At the cabin, loading her few possessions took little time. Tucker insisted on carrying her trunk and carpet bag, while Beatrice gathered the few items she had acquired during her stay, some dried wildflowers she had collected, a book Mrs. Miller had lent her, and the mending she had done on her wedding dress, now altered to serve as a regular gown. Standing in the cabin's main room, Beatrice felt a strange reluctance to leave. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality, Tucker." "I don't know what would have become of me that night if you hadn't appeared." Tucker shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. "You'd have managed, seem like the type who always does." Beatrice smiled at his assessment. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then added impulsively, "I hope you'll come visit me at the schoolhouse sometime. For tea, perhaps." Something flickered in Tucker's eyes, surprise, and maybe something more. "I'd like that," he said simply. Back in town, Tucker helped her arrange her meager furnishings in her new rooms, moving the heavy items with ease and offering practical suggestions about their placement. By the time they finished, the space looked much more like a home. It's coming along nicely, Tucker observed, looking around with satisfaction. Yes, Beatrice agreed. Though I admit I'll miss the comfort of your cabin, it has a certain warmth to it. Tucker's eyes met hers, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Then he cleared his throat and glanced away. Place always felt too empty to me. Was nice knowing someone was making use of it. Before Beatrice could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Miller stood there, a covered basket in her hands. Thought you might need some supper, what with moving and all, she said, bustling in without waiting for an invitation. Her sharp eyes took in the rearranged furniture, and the two of them standing perhaps a bit closer than strictly necessary. Place looks much improved, I must say. Thanks to Tucker's help, Beatrice said quickly. Mrs. Miller hummed noncommittally. Well, I brought enough for two as it happens. Fresh bread, cold chicken, and apple pie. That's mighty kind, Mrs. Miller, Tucker said, but I should be getting back. Nonsense, the older woman interrupted briskly. You've been working hard, and it's nearly dark. No sense riding back to that empty cabin on an empty stomach. With that, she set the basket on Beatrice's newly positioned table and headed for the door. Enjoy your supper. I'll collect the basket tomorrow. When she had gone, Tucker and Beatrice looked at each other and burst into laughter. Did we just get managed? Beatrice asked, still chuckling. Thoroughly, Tucker confirmed with a grin. Mrs. Miller could herd cats if she set her mind to it. Well, she was right about one thing. I am starving, Beatrice admitted, and there's certainly plenty for two. They ate by the light of Beatrice's new lamp, talking easily about the town, the upcoming school term, and Tucker's work at the ranch. As the evening wore on, Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, thoughtful man who had so unexpectedly become her friend. When the meal was finished and the dishes washed, Tucker reluctantly rose to leave. Getting late, should let you get some rest. At the door he hesitated, then asked, That invitation for tea, did you mean it? Of course, Beatrice said, surprised by the question. Tucker nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Sunday afternoon then, if you're not busy. Sunday would be perfect, Beatrice confirmed, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. Good night then, Beatrice, Tucker said softly. Good night, Tucker. After he had gone, Beatrice stood for a long moment looking at the closed door, wondering at the strange path that had led her to this place, and this man. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Beatrice settled into her new life in Hollow Creek. The school term began with 28 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, all packed into the one-room schoolhouse. Despite the challenges of teaching so many different levels simultaneously, Beatrice found herself thriving. The children were eager to learn, their parents supportive, and the work itself deeply satisfying. Tucker had come for tea that Sunday as promised, and the next, and soon it became a regular occurrence, Sunday afternoons spent in conversation over tea and whatever baked goods Beatrice had managed to prepare. Sometimes they walked afterward, exploring the meadows and foothills surrounding the town, Tucker pointing out local plants and wildlife with the easy knowledge of someone deeply connected to the land. Their friendship deepened with each meeting, conversations ranging from books they had read to their hopes and dreams, their pasts and potential futures. Beatrice found herself looking forward to Sundays with increasing anticipation, counting the days between visits. It was during one such Sunday walk, about a month after her arrival in Hollow Creek, that Beatrice first noticed the change in their relationship. They had climbed to a small ridge overlooking the town, the late September sun casting everything in golden light. Tucker had spread his coat on a flat rock for her to sit on, and they were sharing an apple, passing it back and forth as they talked. Never thought I'd settle here, you know, Tucker was saying, looking out over the valley. Came west running from something, not toward anything in particular. What were you running from? Beatrice asked softly, sensing this was something he rarely discussed. Tucker was quiet for a long moment. Failure, mostly, he finally said. Was engaged back in Missouri, had everything planned out, farm of my own, house ready for my bride. Then the river flooded. Lost everything, crops, livestock, most of the house. His jaw tightened at the memory. Josephine's father decided I wasn't such a good prospect after that. She agreed. I'm sorry, Beatrice said, understanding all too well the pain of having future plans destroyed. Tucker shrugged, but she could see the old hurt in his eyes. Worked out for the best, I reckon. Joe married a banker's son the next year, probably happier with him than she ever would have been with me. Their loss is Hollow Creek's gain, Beatrice said firmly. Tucker looked at her then, really looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. And yours? He asked quietly. Beatrice met his gaze steadily. Mine especially. Something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. Tucker's hand found hers, large and calloused but infinitely gentle. For a heartbeat, Beatrice thought he might kiss her, but instead he simply held her hand as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. The moment, though unconsummated, marked a turning point. Their Sunday meetings continued, but now there was an undercurrent of awareness between them, a sense of something building toward an inevitable conclusion. October brought cooler weather and the town's harvest festival, an all-day affair with food, music, games, and dancing. Beatrice, now firmly established as the town's teacher, was expected to attend, and she found herself looking forward to the celebration. The morning of the festival dawned clear and crisp. Beatrice dressed with special care in her best dress, the altered wedding gown, now dyed a deep blue and restyled with help from Mrs. Miller. She had just finished arranging her hair when a knock sounded at her door. Tucker stood on her threshold, looking uncharacteristically nervous and surprisingly formal in a clean shirt, pressed trousers, and a vest she had never seen before. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he spoke. "Thought you might like an escort to the festival," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look beautiful, Beatrice." A warm flush spread across her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you, and yes, I'd love an escort." The festival was held in the meadow beside the church, with tables laden with food, a platform for the musicians, and space cleared for dancing. Throughout the day, Beatrice was introduced to ranchers and their families from the surrounding area, many of whom had children in her school. She noticed with some amusement that Tucker never strayed far from her side, a protective presence that drew knowing looks from Mrs. Miller and other town matrons. As the afternoon wore on, and the music began in earnest, Tucker finally asked the question Beatrice had been waiting for. "Would you care to dance, Miss Dawson?" he asked formally, extending his hand. "I would indeed, Mr. Frost," she replied with equal formality, though her smile gave away her pleasure. Tucker, it turned out, was an excellent dancer, guiding her through the lively reels and waltzes with surprising grace for such a tall man. During a particularly spirited number, Beatrice caught sight of a familiar face watching from the edge of the crowd. Edward Harrington, his expression thunderous as he observed her dancing in Tucker's arms. Her steps faltered slightly, and Tucker immediately noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Edward is here," Beatrice whispered, her eyes darting toward where her former fiancé stood. Tucker's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "Want to leave?" "No," Beatrice said, finding her resolve. "I won't let him spoil today." Tucker nodded approvingly. "That's my girl," he said, then seemed to realize what he'd said and flushed slightly. "I mean, I know what you mean," Beatrice interrupted softly, her heart warming at his slip. "And I don't mind." The music ended, and Tucker led her toward the refreshment table, keeping himself between her and Edward. But their reprieve was short-lived. As Tucker went to fetch them cider, Edward approached, his handsome face set in lines of disapproval. "Beatrice," he said coolly, "I'm surprised to see you still in Hollow Creek. I understood you would be returning east." Beatrice lifted her chin, determined not to show weakness. "My plans changed, Edward, much like yours did." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I see you wasted no time finding companionship, Mr. Frost has been a perfect gentleman," Beatrice replied evenly, "which is more than I can say for some." Edward's eyes narrowed. "I wrote you a letter explaining the situation. It was unfortunate, but these things happen. There was no need to stay and make a spectacle of yourself." "Is there a problem here?" Tucker's deep voice cut through the tension as he returned, 2 cups of cider in hand and a dangerous gleam in his eye. Edward drew himself up, attempting to match Tucker's height and failing. "No problem, just catching up with an old friend." "Didn't sound friendly to me," Tucker observed mildly, though there was steel beneath his casual tone. "This doesn't concern you, Frost," Edward snapped. "Miss Dawson concerns me," Tucker replied simply. "And you're upsetting her." Edward looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Well," he said with a nasty smile, "you certainly landed on your feet quickly, Beatrice. Though I must say, a common cowhand is quite a step down from a mill owner." Tucker tensed beside her, but before he could respond, Beatrice placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Actually, Edward," she said clearly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I would say it's quite a step up from a man who would abandon his fiancé after she traveled 2,000 miles to marry him." A hush fell over the nearby revelers, all pretense of not listening abandoned. Edward's face darkened with anger and embarrassment as he realized they had an audience. "You'll regret this," he hissed before turning on his heel and stalking away. "You all right?" Tucker asked quietly when Edward was gone. Beatrice took a deep breath, surprised to find that she actually was. "Yes, better than all right, in fact." She looked up at Tucker with a small smile. "Thank you for standing by me," his expression softened. "Always will if you'll let me." The simple statement, so earnestly delivered, made Beatrice's heart skip a beat. Before she could respond, however, Mrs. Miller descended upon them, her face alight with gleeful indignation. "Well, the nerve of that man," she exclaimed, fanning herself vigorously. "Coming here and causing a scene after what he did to you. Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say." She patted Beatrice's arm approvingly. "You handled yourself beautifully, my dear. And you," she turned to Tucker, "showed remarkable restraint. Though I wouldn't have minded seeing Edward Harrington take a tumble into the punch bowl." Despite the tension of the confrontation, Beatrice found herself laughing at Mrs. Miller's transparent bloodthirstiness. "Violence wouldn't have solved anything, Mrs. Miller." "Perhaps not," the older woman conceded reluctantly, "but it might have been satisfying to watch." With a final pat to Beatrice's arm and a meaningful look at Tucker, she bustled away to spread the news of the encounter. "She's enjoying this far too much," Beatrice observed wryly. Tucker chuckled. "Mrs. Miller lives for this kind of excitement. You've just made her month." As the evening progressed, word of the confrontation spread through the festival. Beatrice found herself on the receiving end of many sympathetic glances and supportive comments, while Edward was conspicuously absent for the remainder of the celebration. When the dancing resumed after supper, Tucker once again led Beatrice onto the floor, this time for a slow waltz. As they moved together under the stars, with lanterns glowing around the meadow and the music wrapping around them, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for a very long time. "What are you thinking?" Tucker asked softly, his hand warm at her waist. Beatrice looked up at him, no longer afraid to let her feelings show in her eyes. "That sometimes what seems like the worst day of your life can lead to the best days instead." Tucker's gaze intensified. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I know it hasn't been long, but I need to tell you Tucker Frost," a voice called urgently, interrupting whatever he had been about to say. A young ranch hand came running toward them, his face flushed with exertion. "Fire at the Rockingham. Boss sent me to fetch you and any other hands in town." The peaceful moment shattered. Tucker's expression shifted instantly from tender to focused alarm. "How bad?" Barnes gone up, trying to keep it from spreading to the house and other buildings. Tucker turned to Beatrice, conflict clear in his eyes. "I have to go." "Of course you do," she said immediately, despite her disappointment. "Be careful." He squeezed her hand once, then was gone, running toward where the horses were tethered, the young ranch hand at his heels. Beatrice watched him go, the words he had been about to say hanging unspoken in the air between them. The fire at the Rockingham Ranch proved to be a serious affair. The main barn was a total loss, though the men managed to save most of the livestock and prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. Rumors spread through town that the fire had been deliberately set, though no one could prove it. Tucker was kept busy at the ranch for the next 2 weeks, helping to clean up the destruction and begin rebuilding. He sent Beatrice a brief note explaining his absence and expressing regret for their interrupted conversation, but it would be mid-November before he could return to town. The separation, though difficult, gave Beatrice time to examine her own feelings. What had begun as gratitude had undeniably developed into something deeper, something that made her heart race at the thought of seeing him again. By the time Tucker finally returned to town, Beatrice had admitted to herself what she suspected he had been about to say that night at the festival. She was falling in love with him. Their reunion came on a cold, gray afternoon. Beatrice had just dismissed her students for the day when she looked up to find Tucker standing in the schoolhouse doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the wintry light. For a moment, neither spoke, simply drinking in the sight of each other after weeks apart. Then Tucker crossed the room in a few long strides and without preamble took both her hands in his. "I missed you," he said simply. "And I you," Beatrice replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I was going to say that night at the festival," Tucker began. "I know," Beatrice interrupted softly. "At least I hope I know." Tucker's eyes searched hers, hope dawning in their blue depths. "Yeah, I think," Beatrice said carefully, her heart pounding, "that you were going to tell me you have feelings for me. And if that's the case, I want you to know that I have feelings for you too." A smile spread slowly across Tucker's face, transforming his features with joy. "That's exactly what I was going to say, Beatrice Dawson. I've fallen in love with you, and I don't rightly care if it's too soon to say so." Beatrice felt her own smile blooming in response. "Then we're in agreement, Tucker Frost, because I've fallen in love with you too." Tucker's hands tightened on hers. "Can I kiss you now? Been thinking about it for weeks." "I wish you would," Beatrice breathed. His lips met hers gently at first, then with increasing passion as she responded eagerly to his embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you standing on that hotel porch in the rain," he admitted. Beatrice laughed softly. "Even soaking wet in a ruined wedding dress, especially then," Tucker confirmed with a grin. "Never seen anyone so beautiful and so determined, even in the middle of disaster." Their courtship progressed rapidly after that day. Tucker began spending every available moment in town, helping Beatrice prepare her rooms above the schoolhouse for the coming winter, escorting her to church on Sundays, and joining her for dinner several evenings a week. The town watched their romance unfold with approving eyes, Mrs. Miller taking particular satisfaction in what she considered her matchmaking success. "Always knew you two would suit," she told Beatrice smugly as they selected fabric for new winter curtains. "From the very first day, I said to Mr. Miller, that girl's going to be the making of Tucker Frost." And look at you now. December arrived with a heavy snowfall that transformed Hollow Creek into a winter wonderland. The children were delighted, and Beatrice arranged for an early dismissal one afternoon so they could enjoy the snow. As she watched them playing, Tucker appeared beside her, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Got something to show you," he said mysteriously. "Can you come with me for a bit?" Curiosity piqued, Beatrice agreed, and Tucker led her to a waiting sleigh. "Borrowed it from the Andersons," he explained as he helped her in and tucked a warm buffalo robe around her legs. They rode out of town, the sleigh's runners cutting smoothly through the fresh snow. Tucker guided the horse along a familiar path, and Beatrice realized they were heading toward his cabin. "What's this all about?" she asked, her breath forming white puffs in the frigid air. Tucker just smiled. "You'll see." When they reached the cabin, Beatrice immediately noticed changes. The small structure had been expanded, with a new section added to one side. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm light. "Tucker, what have you done?" Beatrice asked in astonishment as he helped her from the sleigh. "Been working on it whenever I could get away from the ranch," he explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Wanted it to be a surprise." He led her inside, where the transformation continued. The once Spartan interior now boasted new furnishings, including a rocking chair by the fire, bookshelves filled with volumes, and colorful quilts draping the expanded sleeping area, now partially separated from the main room by a wooden screen. "It's wonderful," Beatrice breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. But why? Tucker took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Beatrice's heart began to race as he dropped to one knee before her. "Beatrice Dawson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "When you came to Hollow Creek, you were looking for a husband and a home. Found neither that first day." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "I'm hoping you might consider accepting both from me now." Tears sprang to Beatrice's eyes. "Oh, Tucker. I know it hasn't been long," he continued earnestly. "And I know this cabin's not much compared to what you might have had in Boston, but I promise you this: I will love you every day of my life, and wherever we are together will be home." "Yes," Beatrice said without hesitation, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Tucker Frost, I will marry you." Joy blazed across his face as he rose to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "Only thing I have left of hers." "It's perfect," Beatrice assured him, admiring how the pearl caught the firelight. "Absolutely perfect." She looked around the cabin once more, understanding now the purpose behind the renovations. "And our home is perfect, too." Tucker gathered her into his arms, his expression serious despite his evident happiness. "Are you sure, Beatrice? Life out here won't be easy. It'll be hard work, long days, and sometimes the winters can be brutal." Beatrice placed her hand against his cheek, marveling at how this place had so completely captured her heart in such a short time. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she told him truthfully. "I love you, Tucker, and I love the life we can build here together." His answer was a kiss that left no doubt of his feelings, deep and tender and full of promise. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Hollow Creek, with Mrs. Miller sniffling proudly in the front pew and the entire town in attendance. Beatrice wore a new dress of deep green velvet, her hair adorned with holly berries and evergreen sprigs. Tucker, handsome in a new suit, watched her walk down the aisle with such love in his eyes that Beatrice felt her heart might burst from happiness. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Tucker kissed her for the first time as Mrs. Frost, cheers erupted from the congregation. The celebration continued at the hotel, which had been decorated festively for the occasion. Even the hotel keeper who had turned Beatrice away that stormy night seemed genuinely pleased for the couple, offering stammered congratulations and free champagne by way of apology. "Never thought I'd be thanking him," Beatrice murmured to Tucker as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "But if he hadn't turned me away that night, we might never have met." Tucker's arms tightened around her waist. "Reckon some things are just meant to be one way or another." As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Tucker leaned down to whisper in Beatrice's ear. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Frost?" The words sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Yes," she replied softly. "Take me home." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, dusting everything with diamond-like sparkles in the moonlight. Tucker had borrowed the Andersons' sleigh once more, now decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons courtesy of the schoolchildren. He helped Beatrice in, wrapped her in furs against the cold, and took his place beside her. As they glided away from the town, Beatrice leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her. The path that had led her here had been unexpected and at times painful, but looking up at the stars scattered like silver across the velvet sky, she couldn't imagine any other destination. Tucker's arm came around her, drawing her closer against the cold. "Happy?" he asked softly. Beatrice turned her face up to his, seeing all her future in his eyes. "Completely," she assured him. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." And as their sleigh carried them through the silent, snow-covered landscape toward the warm light of their cabin, their home, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found something far more precious than what she had originally sought in coming west. She had found not just a husband or a home, but a love that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. "I love you, Tucker Frost," she whispered as their home came into view, golden light spilling from its windows to guide them through the darkness. "And I love you, Beatrice Frost," he replied, his voice low and fervent. "Now and always." The sleigh glided to a stop before their cabin door. Tucker lifted Beatrice into his arms, carrying her across the threshold as snowflakes danced around them. Inside, a fire blazed in the hearth, casting warm light over the space they would share as husband and wife. Setting her gently on her feet, Tucker kissed her once more, then smiled down at her with all the love in his heart shining in his eyes. "Welcome home," he said simply. And in those 2 words, in the cabin that had once sheltered a desperate stranger and now embraced a beloved wife, Beatrice found everything she had ever wanted. The spring that followed their winter wedding brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As the snow melted and wildflowers once again carpeted the meadows around Hollow Creek, Beatrice discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Tucker one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. His reaction first stunned silence, then overwhelming joy was everything she could have hoped for. He gathered her in his arms, careful yet exuberant, pressing kisses to her face and murmuring words of love and wonder. "A baby," he kept saying as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Our baby." The news spread quickly through the small community, bringing a flood of well wishes and practical gifts. Mrs. Miller, predictably, took charge of organizing what she called necessary preparations, arriving at the cabin with armloads of baby clothing she had been secretly making since the wedding. "Always knew you two wouldn't waste time," she said with satisfaction, as she sorted tiny garments into neat piles. "This little one will have the whole town wrapped around their finger before they're a month old." Beatrice continued teaching until the end of the school term, her condition causing much excitement among her students. The school board readily agreed to hold her position for her, arranging for a temporary teacher during her confinement and early motherhood. Tucker, meanwhile, threw himself into further improvements to their home. He added another room specifically for the baby, installed larger windows to let in more light, and built a proper garden for Beatrice to grow vegetables and flowers. "Never thought I'd be settling down like this," he admitted one night as they lay together, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "Always figured I'd just drift from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots. Are you happy with this life?" Beatrice asked, a rare moment of insecurity washing over her. "It's so different from what you planned." Tucker propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with such tenderness that her doubts immediately began to fade. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he assured her. "Every morning I wake up beside you. I think I must be the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory." Their daughter, Elizabeth Miller Frost, was born on a clear September day with Mrs. Miller serving as midwife and Tucker pacing anxiously outside until the first lusty cries announced his child's arrival. When finally allowed inside, he approached the bed where Beatrice lay cradling their newborn with such reverence that tears sprang to her eyes. Tucker, her strong, capable husband who could break wild horses and face down armed cattle rustlers without flinching, looked absolutely terrified at the prospect of holding his tiny daughter. "She won't break," Beatrice assured him softly, placing the swaddled infant in his arms. Tucker cradled Elizabeth as if she were made of the finest porcelain, his calloused finger gently stroking her downy cheek. "She's perfect," he whispered, awe in his voice, "just like her mother." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch Tucker worked for changed hands, and the new owner recognized his value, promoting him to foreman with a substantial increase in salary. Beatrice returned to teaching, bringing Elizabeth with her until she was old enough to join the class as a student. Their family grew with the addition of a son, Thomas James Frost, born 2 years after Elizabeth. The children thrived in the freedom of their country life, growing strong and sure under their parents' loving guidance. Edward Harrington eventually left Hollow Creek, his lumber mill sold to a larger company based in Cheyenne. Beatrice felt nothing but a distant pity when she heard the news, any lingering hurt long since healed by the happiness she had found with Tucker. On the 5th anniversary of the night they first met, Tucker surprised Beatrice with a special gift, the deed to a small ranch of their own, purchased with savings he had carefully accumulated. "Been working toward this since before we married," he confessed as she stared at the document in disbelief. "Wanted to give you and the children a legacy." "Oh, Tucker," Beatrice breathed, overwhelmed by his generosity and foresight. "It's wonderful. But you know I've been happy with our life just as it is." "I know," he said, drawing her into his arms. "That's one of the countless reasons I love you, Beatrice Frost. You've never asked for more than I could give, never made me feel like I wasn't enough." "Because you've always been more than enough," she assured him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "From that very first night when you said this is home, you gave me exactly what I needed most." Their new ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Tucker had a natural way with livestock, while Beatrice's organizational skills and education proved invaluable for the business side of their operation. They named it Shelter Ranch, a reminder of how their story began. As Hollow Creek grew from a small frontier settlement into a proper town, Beatrice and Tucker remained central figures in the community. Beatrice eventually became head of the school board, while Tucker served several terms as town council member. Their home was always open to those in need, just as Tucker's cabin had once sheltered a desperate bride on a stormy night. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they hosted a celebration at the ranch, inviting the entire town to share in their happiness. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Tucker found Beatrice standing alone on the porch, watching their children play with friends in the yard. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Frost," he said, slipping his arm around her waist. Beatrice leaned into his embrace, still feeling the same thrill at his touch that she had when they first fell in love. "I was just thinking about that night in the rain," she said softly. "How desperate I felt, how certain that everything was ruined." Tucker's arm tightened around her. "Never would have wished that pain on you, but I can't help being grateful for the storm that brought you to my door." "As am I," Beatrice agreed, turning in his arms to face him. At 35, Tucker was even more handsome than the day they met, the lines at the corners of his eyes and the touch of silver at his temples only adding to his appeal. "Every hardship led me to you, and I wouldn't change a moment of it." Tucker lowered his head to kiss her, still as tender and passionate as ever. "Happy anniversary, my love," he murmured against her lips. "Happy anniversary," Beatrice replied, her heart full. "Here's to many more." And as they rejoined their guests, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and their beloved children, Beatrice knew that the life they had built together, this home they had created, was richer and more wonderful than anything she could have imagined on that rainy night so many years ago. The unexpected journey that had begun with a denied shelter had led to the greatest blessing of all, a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives, as steadfast and true as the mountains that watched over their home. Years later, when Elizabeth was preparing for her own wedding, she found her mother in the attic of their ranch house, gently unfolding a carefully preserved white dress. "Is that your wedding dress, Mama?" she asked, running her fingers over the fine fabric. Beatrice smiled, memories washing over her. "Not the one I wore when I married your father," she explained. "This is the dress I was wearing the night we met." She told her daughter the full story, then the abandoned bride, the stormy night, the kindness of a stranger that had changed everything. Elizabeth listened, entranced, having heard only pieces of it before. "So romantic," she sighed when Beatrice finished, "like something from a novel." "Life often is, if you look at it the right way," Beatrice told her, carefully refolding the dress. "Even the hardest moments can lead to the greatest joys." That evening, as she and Tucker sat on their porch watching another Wyoming sunset, Beatrice shared the conversation with her husband. "Told Elizabeth our story today," she said, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. Tucker smiled, the same smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "And did you tell her that her father was so smitten at first sight that he nearly tripped over his own boots, trying to help the beautiful stranger on the hotel porch?" Beatrice laughed, the sound as bright and clear as ever. "I may have left out that particular detail. Probably for the best," Tucker conceded with a chuckle. "Need to maintain some dignity in my daughter's eyes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Do you ever wonder," Beatrice asked eventually, "how different our lives might have been if Jasper had let me stay at the hotel that night?" Tucker considered the question seriously. "Reckon I would have found you eventually," he decided. "Some things are just meant to be, Beatrice, and you and me, we were always meant to find each other." Beatrice rested her head against his shoulder, contentment settling over her like a favorite quilt. "I believe that too," she said softly. "This was always our destiny." And as darkness fell completely, wrapping around their home like a protective embrace, Beatrice Frost knew with absolute certainty that the frightened, heartbroken bride she had once been would be at peace knowing where her journey had led to this man. This family, this home filled with love. It had been, after all, the perfect shelter in the storm.